All right, everybody, welcome to this week's class for Podmatch. We're going to be talking about how to grow your podcast through press releases, how we can actually learn how to do this really well. This is a topic that I'm really excited about personally. I've done one press release ever. It was with Mickie, and it saw a lot of success, so I'm excited to go ahead and dive into this topic. Before we get started here, Mickie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background when it comes to PR specifically?
Sure. So I went to grad school about 26, 27 years ago with pursuing an MFA degree in creative writing with an emphasis in poetry. And I assumed I would just be waiting tables the rest of my life. But I did that and found after a few weeks that standing on my feet 8 to 12 hours a day was not for me. So I went and got a job at a telecom startup as employee number 3. I had to do a million different things, but one of them was handle their press releases and send those out. And we were sending out through fax at the time. And we had just bought a state-of-the-art fax machine that held 100 numbers. Unfortunately, we had to send to 180 to 190 journalists. So I'd program it with 100 numbers, hit send. It would take all day to send. And then the next day I would delete those numbers and have to put 80 or 90 different ones in. And we started to get phone calls from journalists asking if we could just email the release. It was easier for them to copy and paste a lot of the numbers and statistics that we had. And so I mentioned to my boss that I feel like email is a natural evolution and someone should just send releases through email. And he said, that's a good business idea. You should do it. So I spent about a year in my free time, which there wasn't much because I was working for a startup, contacting journalists. And about a year later, I launched eReleases almost 23 years ago. And I had 10,000 journalists in my database. And I just offered my service on the web. People found out about it, and it slowly grew over time. Several years after that, PR Newswire approached me and said, hey, you should also send your releases through us. And I pointed out, well, I know that I charge my clients just a couple $100. You charge $1,000 to move a press release nationally. I don't think I can afford to offer that. And so we spent a long time trying to figure out how we could work together. One of the big aha moments for me was I visited their editorial office and realized that they had overnight editorial, and they said they don't do much at all. They said that they are there because they have to be in case there's breaking news or something they want to get out to Asia, or there's just a need for it, especially with publicly traded companies. But I said, what if I scheduled all my releases for next business day and your overnight editorial team worked on them, and it wouldn't cost you any additional labor? And that was one of the things that got it to where we could come up with pricing that works. And so all of the releases that we send out go out nationally over PR Newswire, as well as the email sends that we did from the beginning. We're still doing those, and journalists are still finding out about our clients.
I think it's so cool, Mickie. Thanks for sharing that story. Like you clearly, you found a niche, and this was, did you say 23 years ago? Is that what you said?
Yeah, almost. It'll be 23 years in October.
My goodness. Like, talk about like figuring it out and just working your way into it. Now, eReleases is like, you guys are like one of the premier names in the space, which is just really cool to be able to see. Did that like naturally just evolved as you continued to think strategically and come up with ideas other people weren't doing? Is it just continuously grown year over year? Or what
It
does that like
has.
really look like for you guys?
Yeah. So right now we have 6 full-time editors. We have about 3 other people on salary that
Yeah,
help and assist
yeah,
us.
tranqui, sí.
And in addition to that, it's freelancers when it comes to writing services and things like that. We initially were going to hire someone full time for writing, but we found that with our clients in different industries and things like that, it's better to have a freelancer that might have an expertise in fashion, another one that's geared towards nutraceuticals and things like that. So the freelancing is just something that has actually been an advantage over time when it comes to servicing the press release writing.
So cool. Well, I'm excited to talk more about your business and how we'd be able to work with you and things like that. But we'll get into that in a little bit here. First off, I want to talk about maybe some of the benefits from the standpoint of podcasting, whether you're a guest or a host. When would be an appropriate time? Well, first off, let's just get right into the question. Like, what is a press release? Like, if someone doesn't know, because Mickie, when I first met you, the first conversation I had with you was an introduction from our mutual friend, Chris Kremitzos. And I got on a call and I was like, this is what I said to him, everybody. I was like, Mickie, I don't understand. I don't even know what a press release is. Like, can you just explain it to me? And thankfully, Mickie walked me through it very graciously. For anybody who might be in that same boat, can you just explain what this means to somebody?
Yeah, it's basically a third person announcement, usually written in the third person, company is, and things like that. If there is something that's in the first person, it's usually in a quote. Usually, in the case of a podcast, might be the podcast host or someone that's working for the podcast. If it's focusing on a guest, it could be a quote from the guest as well. It generally answers the who, what, when, where, how, and why of what you're announcing, and you're leading with your most important aspect first. What strategically is important here that you're announcing, and why should people care? And that's the one thing that I always tell people that you really need to crack the code on, is trying to determine that what it is that an audience of a journalist would be interested in. The journalist is a gatekeeper, and he's not going to let your message through and write an article about you unless there's something there that he really wants to share with his readers. And you kind of have to sort of be really creative here, because it's easy to come up with what it is that you want to announce. I have a new podcast, or I have a particular episode that I feel should do really well because of X, Y, and Z. Well, can you write about it and lead from a place that would make a journalist say, wow, that is really cool, I want to share it with my readers?
So I never really thought about it from the standpoint of the journalists themselves. So he or she that's writing, they need to first off see the value for the people that make up their readership. So just saying, I've got a new podcast episode coming out, can you do something about it, is probably never going to work. Is that right?
I mean, it can work, but it's much less likely to work compared to something that might be a little more strategic. Um, for example, things that the media loves and journalists loves are numbers, statistics, surveys, things like that. Sometimes you can take public numbers that already exist out there and present it in a way that is really interesting, and then position your podcast in context to it. We've determined that pick a podcast, pick a theme. uh, uh, you know Historical podcasts are growing, and here's a new podcast dedicated to Abraham Lincoln. This is a real example. And this is why it's important, and we're launching on President's Day. And so that was a podcast that did an announcement over the wire, and they actually got picked up in a couple of places, including it was either a PBS or NPR affiliate talked about it. And so you could understand, they cover a lot of historical stuff and things like that. So they thought it was interesting enough to share with their audience. And, anything about PBS and NPR is they have a massive audience. So that's a great way to, getting them to cover you is really good, because it could really drive a lot of traffic to you and about your messaging.
So you're having these like numbers, statistics, surveys, things that are of interest to the specific PR that you are reaching out to, or the journalist in general. Do you recommend just creating your own list and blasting it out, or is it better to work with someone like eReleases to just find that right area for you? And what are you going to do? Are you going to say, okay, this is very specific to historians? Am I just going to look at that niche and send it out there, or is it still best just to blast out everywhere?
So all the releases that go out through the newswire are tagged for national distribution, and then it's got tags for industries and subsets there within. So there's lots of ways to view releases. Let's say, for example, if you cover history and things like that, it might be tagged academic or educational. There's lots of ways that these things get tagged at the newswire. So people in that space would see that release. And it's still available to everyone else. It's just a national general interest press release. But to the people for whom it probably would be a better fit, it's tagged and segmented just for them. So when a journalist looks at releases, they can look at everything just streaming like the Matrix, or they can look at just their industry. But a lot of them also look at their industry with certain tags, and sometimes they'll exclude tags or include tags, and so they really get a very customized feel of types of releases that they're looking at. When it comes to the email distribution that we generally do very micro sends. We don't want to send a release to everybody in the education market, knowing that some of those are sports education, some are math and sciences, and they're not going to be interested in a podcast on Abraham Lincoln. So we do try to drill down, because what happens is if we send a lot of off-target stuff, the journalist unsubscribes and they're removed permanently from our ability to reach them in the future. So we do try to really hone in on who we're trying to reach. That being said, I realize that a lot of people starting out don't have budgets, and using a service like eReleases is just outside their ability to do. And one of the great things is, if you're willing to do it, you can go out and reach the media directly. For a very esoteric thing like a historical podcast, you would just probably say, what are 20 publications that I feel might be a good fit for this or cover this, and then do the legwork of finding out who the editors or writers are at that place, who would be the best one at that place, if you can winnow it down to just one or two, and just contact them. Most email addresses are out there. If you don't know it, you can contact the source and they'll give it to you. Journalists really don't try to play a game of hiding so that you can't reach them. They are supposed to be accessible. Media is supposed to be open. So I've never had a problem calling and asking for a journalist email address and not getting it. I have had instances where they say, I can give you the email address, but if you're looking to reach them, you're going to have a better response on Twitter. And so, that's one thing to keep in mind. There are journalists who really have one preference over another. So I would always, go according to what their preference is. And you can create your own Rolodex. If, the smaller you are, and the smaller the number of people that you're trying to reach, it's very easy and not overwhelming to reach them. And in those cases, you may not even have to write a press release. You could just announce what it is that you're doing, like say, here's a new podcast I'm doing, here's a link to my about section. I feel this is really important right now because a lot of people are discussing let's say African Americans in the United States and what their relationship is, going all the way back to slavery to modern times. And we're really examining the life and times of Abraham Lincoln, and we feel this is a very topical subject. You just put a pitch together with a few sentences as to why this is relevant right now, and send it to these people and just email them individually. It's as easy as that. It doesn't have to come from a bona fide, large company. Generally, the large companies have the worst time getting articles written about them because they have so much money and funding. Journalists are a little resentful of like, why would I write a free article for Microsoft Word when they could just buy an ad? They like the idea of being curators and finding little hidden gems and discoveries that a lot of people don't know about. So the smaller unknown companies and podcasts and shows and things like that have the same opportunity, maybe even a better opportunity, if they can just really come up with a compelling message.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear, Mickie. So for me personally, and many of the people attending today and that will be watching the replay, we're those smaller independent podcast guests or hosts. Like that kind of fits us quite a bit. So I want to move on here, and I know we have some questions coming through the chat, but real quick, I want to make sure we really understand what is considered like newsworthy. So for me, I don't have like a super interesting podcast like you talked about. I shouldn't, that's a terrible way to say it. My podcast is very interesting, but it's not covering some specific topic. It's more so entrepreneurship. So week to week, when I release new episodes, I don't know there's anything that's worthy of me saying, let's get a press release going about this episode. What would you say somebody like me that maybe has just been podcasting for a couple of years now, like when would be a milestone, or is there a certain topic that should be like, this is one I should go after? Like when would be the right time for me to attempt to use that to grow my listenership?
I would say try to focus on something that's very topical right now that you could become a de facto expert in. For example, you're doing entrepreneurship. Right now, we're coming out of a pandemic. There's some unknowns in the future. I think that if you did a small survey of your community and got some responses, generally, if you get 100 or more responses, journalists will publish the numbers of where entrepreneurs are right now. Are they cutting back? Are they looking to spend less in marketing? Are they looking to spend more? What's their outlook for the future? Are they pessimistic or optimistic? Do they believe that things are going to be better the next 12 months and stuff like that? So if you can sort of take the temperature of your community through a survey or study, maybe throw in one or two oddball questions, because I always recommend that to my clients, and I'm amazed probably 70% of the time it's those oddball questions that they just put in at the last minute that really makes the release go viral. And by go viral, I mean, like, I routinely see 16 to 24 articles written, not the press release replicated 16 or 24 times, but individual unique articles that were written by a journalist, 16 to 24 for a really good press release that is on a survey or study. And of course, who you are, your podcast, why you're this authority, and here are your results. You may link directly to a page that has a lot more information about the study or survey's results, but you may want to just highlight in the press release, because you kind of want to stay under 500 to 600 words, what the most important things came out of it. And if you find a really great observation that you believe, let's say, the current community that you've surveyed feels that things are very optimistic and looking forward, they feel things are great and they're willing to spend more money, then you'd have a really great compelling quote that you come up with that sort of talks about that and why that's important. And so all of that packaged together creates a really compelling piece of content for a journalist, because journalist is like, wow, the community of entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial podcasters are really positive outlook on the next 6 months or 12 months, and they're looking to spend more money, they're looking to engage more, and all of this is really compelling content I want to share out there to my audience of business readers who might find this really interesting.
I like the fact that you're kind of sticking to a point that you made earlier, which is statistic surveys. Those work really well. I like that you really shared that. And this, you're talking about doing a survey among your listenership, which not all of us are entrepreneurship podcasters, but we all have access to somehow do like a survey among our listeners, the people that we're around. And I think that's really powerful. I like that you mentioned the oddball questions as well. My head immediately went to some like really funny ones. Can you just share like one good example of or a couple good examples even of oddball
Sure.
questions that are even funny maybe?
So I had an auto repair shop in Pennsylvania do a survey. They were looking to get auto industry trade publications to link to them for SEO was their big thing, because they had a new URL. Their old website went down because it was free from the yellow pages, and I don't know if the yellow pages ended or they quit hosting pages, but they were really upset because no one could find them. And an SEO company said, if you could get some links from auto industry trade publications, you would rank really fast. And so I told them, as an auto repair shop in Pennsylvania, there's nothing newsworthy about you. You're going to have to manufacture your own newsworthiness. I think a survey or study is the best way to do it. And once they developed it, they're like, who do we send it to? And I said, other auto industry people, other auto repair shops. And they're like, I know this guy across town and I hate him. That's about it. So I told them, just go to a small trade association and ask if they'll send a link of your survey to their members and tell them that you'll mention them in your press release that you're issuing over PR Newswire. And so when they told them that, they were like, oh yeah, sure. They sent it out. They put it on social media as well. They got like 800 respondents. I think they only had 1,400 members for the whole trade association. Almost 2/3 of them from the emails and the social media completed the survey. The oddball question was, what's the strangest thing a customer has left in their car while being repaired? And it was an open field, allowed them to put a couple sentences in there. And, statistically, nobody put the same answer in. So there was no statistical relevance to the answers, but it was the one that went viral. There were strange stories. There was a boa constrictor. There was grandma left in an urn, and they had to retrieve her in time to take her to a memorial service. And there's little fun stories like that. But these were the stories that got picked up. And 10 auto industry trade publications wrote about it. And they all gravitated to that one question and what some of the responses were. Some only published like a dozen, some published like 20. We had over, I think, 70 or so that were listed on the website. We didn't put them all in the press release because it would just be too much information. But it worked. I mean, it was very entertaining. You could understand why an auto trade publication would want to share it, because these are just strange, wacky little tales that are part of natural life. And sometimes if you can just think of something like that when you're doing a survey, it can really give you a huge advantage. If you can just sort of say, if I was to sit across the table from someone in my industry and just want to get one of the most craziest stories from them, what question would I ask? And if you can do that, you can do really well with these surveys. And like I said, in the example of these trade associations, if you target the smaller and independent trade associations, they will bend over backwards to work with you and help you. The big trade associations get all the love and they're harder to deal with. So the small ones are really great for these partnerships. They see it as a win-win, and they'll often send it to their members.
Very cool. I mean, I love that example. And what you're really talking about here is thinking outside the box, right? Like, what's something interesting that people would want to share? And sometimes even just the normal statistics that many of us already know, it's we don't really care as much anymore, right? Like when people want to tell me that 60% of entrepreneurs are over budget on marketing, I've heard that before, right? Like I just made that stat up. But in general, like that's not as interesting. But if you tell me that 60% of them are tired of working from home, I'd be like, now that's interesting. Like, let me read a little bit more about that because it does something. So I know I'm using entrepreneurship, everybody, as my example because that's where I'm at. But in your own space, in your own field, you can think of something as well that you'd be able to kind of come up with here. So, Mickie, loving this so far. I want to quickly talk formatting, and then we'll move into some open Q&A. I know we got some questions coming through the chat here, but you mentioned staying between 500 and 600 words and kind of gave us a little bit of framework there. But can you just walk us through from beginning to end what an ideal press release looks like?
Right. So an ideal press release would have a headline. You want it to be captivating and contextually conveys what you're releasing. You don't want to use puns and be clever. You leave that for the journalists to come up with for their readers. But you really, journalists want to see what it is you're announcing more importantly than a clever pun that they have to click through to figure out what the release is about. You want to lead with your most important message in your first sentence, your first paragraph. You really want to push across what it is that you're announcing, why it's important. You then want to provide backup information, include those quotes that we talked about. Towards the end, you often see what we call a boilerplate. It's usually an about section. In the case of this, it'd be like about podcast name, show, whatever. And then it's usually anywhere from 3 to 5 sentences that you just recycle. It's your elevator pitch of what you're about, what's your podcast about. And these generally get used again and again. You might update the boilerplate over time, but it really just stays the same. And it's really good for just providing a basic snapshot of who you are, what you're about, and the market that you serve. Then there's the contact information. It's usually a person's name, email address, phone number, and that's pretty much it. You definitely want to make sure you include a phone number, because the last thing that a journalist hates is their managing editor right before a story goes to print says, "Oh, I was just reviewing that article again, and I'm not sure if X, Y, and Z in the article is accurate. Could you contact them and make sure it is before it goes to print?" And all of a sudden, if they only have an email address, it makes it very difficult for them to get that last thing. Stories, a lot of stories live and die in those last 45 minutes before they go to press, because if it gets pulled, it may just not find a home in the future, the next day, or in the or sometimes down the line. Your opportunity is gone, so you don't want to miss it. So that's why the newswire requires the phone number, and it's really important that you have one. A Google Voice works if you're doing screening or anything like that. Just some way that they can contact you and have some feeling that they would be able to get a hold of someone quickly if they needed to.
All right, that's a good hack there for the end. But the ideal press release is a headline which covers what you're announcing, not necessarily something clever, unique. Let the journalist come up with that. Lead with your most important message in that first few sentences. Specifically, get really clear on what it's about from the start, and have your backup information, including quotes or anything that could support what you're sharing. And then about you, about your show, your elevator pitch, if you will, followed by contact information. Again, having that phone number in there is very important, so your press release doesn't die before it gets launched. Some
Right.
great
And
points
another
here.
thing
Yeah.
to mention is multimedia. You can have links in your press release. You can include up to 2 images. Might be a company logo, or your show's logo. Might be a picture of the host or something like that. Because so much stuff is produced online, they love having pictures that they can include as well. So definitely include the whatever the limit is that you're allowed wherever you send it, to make sure that you have some collateral there. And you may want to include links to a YouTube or an audio if you want to share a segment of your show or something that you feel would be a pretty good example of what you're doing.
Would you say that there's any links that are off limits that maybe you just shouldn't include, or is it kind of fair game from that regard? You
I think
laugh.
it's fair
You've been asked
game
that before, right?
unless it's not safe for work. We do get some adult novelty press releases, and we have to be very careful that they don't have live links in them, because the newswire doesn't want there to be live links in those types of press releases. But they do allow the URL to be there. It's just broken, so that you would have to copy and paste it, repair it into a browser. But that would be the only type of thing that I think would be off limits, that you wouldn't want to include. I also think you don't want to overload them with too much stuff where they could get distracted and run off lots of different rabbit holes. I would say, the most important link or links are completely appropriate. But if you provide too many, there might be too many paths for them to just go and get lost.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you want to have some sort of at least close to singular call to action, I think is really important. Now, if you wanted to link to more about you or about your podcast, it makes sense. But specifically, if you had an episode where you talked about the results of a survey you did, you'd want to go to that more than likely. So, okay, good point. All right, I want to open this up to other people as well. I know there's questions coming through the chat, which I'm going to get caught up in on there. If somebody has a question they'd like to ask now, though, feel free just to unmute and go for it. Hopefully that doesn't turn into like a craziness. Let's be respectful of whoever unmutes first, and just let them ask questions or make observations to Mickie here. But anyone who is interested, go ahead and unmute while I'm kind of reading through some of these here. Wow, Mickie, you're doing a really good job. No one has any questions. Actually, I've got a few here. Barbie, you've asked a couple. Do you mind unmuting to share one of these?
Sure. So my first question was about word count, which you covered, but my second question, follow-up question is, you said 500 to 600 words. Does that include the about us section and quotes?
It does.
Everything is 500 to 600. I've done press releases in the past, but I've never paid attention to how many words I was doing. I just made them all one page. So I didn't know that there was like a certain number.
Well, the newswire tends to charge starting at 400 words and above. So that $1,000 they charge at 400 words,
Yeah.
They want another $200 or $300 for each 100 block of up to 100 words after that. So that's generally why people watch their word count. And it's a holdover from the old teletype systems where every word was a chore to send. So you wanted to be really concise. And now with the electronic distribution of press releases, it's really not important. But the newswire still holds by charging extra because they believe that they're helping journalists by making people be more concise and less wordy. And so that's their defense of it. We charge extra, I think, depending on the package. But our newsmaker, I think, is 500 words. And like I said, we're not $200 or $300 per block of extra words. It's just $100 to make it a little more manageable. But that being said, I would say most press releases can be within 500 to 600 words. The big exceptions I have is where someone's really trying to get something very technical and trying to explain it out there, and they just need to break it down, or rather than link to a page or something like that. But I think that most of the times being more concise does a better job to really refine your messaging and make sure you're presenting yourself, as quickly and easily as possible.
Thank you so much. I'll be paying more attention.
Sure.
We had a question from Kira, and she wants to know, where would you recommend to post a press release? For small podcasts, is it appropriate to post on our own website?
Yes. So I always tell people, make sure you put your press releases on your own website. It's free content. It's completely very relevant content. It speaks to your audience. It talks about you. Google will find it and spider it, and it'll be more traffic to your website. I would say if you have a newsletter, I know some podcasters do have newsletters so that they can communicate with their audience. I think, putting a press release in your newsletter is also great. Anywhere natural that you share stuff, social media is appropriate to share your press release with. When it comes to sending it out to journalists, that's where I would try to come up, if you're doing it yourself, come up with what are the 20 places that I feel I would love for this to appear, and I feel I have a pretty good chance of getting some success. And it's kind of, throw a couple in there that are like long shots, but include some that you feel like, I do think I would have pretty good chance of getting picked up. It's not like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, but maybe those are your wish list. Find out the journalist at those places that would probably cover a podcast like yours and send to them, but also include some people that you might have a really good chance of getting some success with. And if you have a budget and you feel that your audience is so large that you could never represent the hundreds and hundreds of people that you could potentially reach, then a paid service would be really appropriate. The thing to keep in mind with is that there are services out there that send press releases to journalists, and then there's services out there that send them to zero journalists, but syndicate them across various websites. And by syndication, they take your press release and they put it on various websites. And I know someone mentioned a couple of places here. If generally, if it's under $300 or $400 and they're sending it out nationally, it's not going over a newswire. The big exception is eReleases. But my next biggest competitor that includes a national distribution over a newswire is $900. So generally, if it's $200 or $300, $400 or less, it's usually just syndication and probably not reaching journalists. Service like PR Web is web only syndication and doesn't generally reach journalists. So it's one of those things that you just have to keep in mind when you are sending out a release, that if you are going to spend money, if it's just $100 or $200 and it's just going to be syndicated to a couple of places, it's not going to probably be picked up in any articles or turned into articles. So I would probably just save your money and just, until you have a budget that you can afford to send a release over a proper newswire, just do it yourself and try to build your own little Rolodex and send it out there.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I appreciate that.
Sure.
You actually just answered Paul's question as well. He had a really good question here. Doesn't matter which company we use. I'm glad you mentioned that. Now, it kind of like leading off that question, because I think it's a really good point here, is if we are sending out press releases. We're working with a good company. I'm just going to use eReleases as an example because that's who I use and who I like. Well, let's just imagine we're doing that, but how should we come up with like a strategy for how often we do that? Or is it okay just to do something one time? Like let's say we do a one-time survey, or we have, I don't know, we hit 300 episodes and we have 5,000 people listening to our podcast, or it's been out for 5 years or something like that. We decided to do just that one milestone. Should we come up with a plan of every 3 or 6 months we should be doing another release? Or is it something where you say one time is okay?
I would say that one time isn't a PR campaign. And so that's the downside of it. A proper PR campaign is usually 4 to 6 releases over a time period. Could be 6 months, could be a year. But when you do a PR campaign, you're going to come in and say, what are some strategic press releases I could do? And what are the different angles or hooks that I could do? One of which could be a survey or study. You could actually come up with multiple surveys or studies over time if you get really good at it and you like the results that you're getting. I have one client that does 30 to 40 surveys a year, and almost every single one of them gets between 12 and 30 articles written about them. They cover a lot of different high-tech verticals, and so each survey is geared towards that one vertical, and so it works for them. That being said, I would say, what are some strategic types of approaches you could do? One might be a blind spot analysis. What do people talk about in your industry or community, and what do they not talk about? And is that dirty little secret that nobody talks about in your industry something that would be ripe for discussing? I had someone do a press release on what nobody talked about in their industry, and it blew up. Almost every trade publication picked it up, and we continued to do releases on that subject. The subject was marketing, and they were floor trade publications. They were a carpet company in New Jersey, and they said nobody talks about marketing, and it's the most frustrating thing as a local carpet company because we're going against these big box home improvement stores, and we have to market against them. And so we wrote a press release about that. It's sort of a David and Goliath approach, but it also includes some tips that they use when they go and compete against the big box home improvement stores. Immediately 10 floor trade publications picked it up, which at the time we didn't even realize there was that many. And after that, we continued to get picked up as they did the same marketing trend, different marketing takes over the next few months. And what we did is we discovered this marketing was a blind spot in their industry, and it was a blind spot that we were able to take advantage of. Sometimes the blind spots are there, and they're there for a reason. We did the same thing with another company that handled cybersecurity, and they pointed out a bunch of vulnerabilities, and nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody picked it up. And they actually got a few phone calls warning them, saying, everybody knows these exist. Nobody talks about them for a reason, because there's no solution. All you're doing is making yourself look like an ass. And so in his case, it didn't work at all, but you don't know until you try. And in the case of the carpet company, they ended up getting about 30 clips over a 6-month period, and they put them together. And when they went out to give a quote to someone, they went through it with them and showed all these national publications that wrote about them, and they started to convert about 20% more leads as a result of that. And that's what happens when you do get media pickup. It's like an implied endorsement for you. So when that happens, make sure that you record that clip, get screenshots, share it on your website, share it on your social media, let your audience know about it. You've got to brag yourself, even, all your little accomplishments. And it really helps. It makes it easier to get sponsors. It makes it easier to get on people's radar. And so, those are all things that you can do, and it'll help establish you as a brand.
Some great points there. I'm going to circle back to some of those real quick. Angie, you had a really good question. Would you mind asking Mickie that question?
Hi, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. My question was, if we have experience writing press releases, is there a service where you would then push it out? And the reason I'm asking is I have a long history in artist management. And all of my PR contacts are in the music industry. And what I've realized now that I'm in podcasting is that my amazing publicists that I've worked with for years don't really know what to do with podcasts. And so while I'm confident that I could, help my clients write their releases, I just don't have the bandwidth to do what you've done for 23 years and have all the contacts and, know how to
Right.
actually service it.
So about 95% of the press releases that we issue were not written by us. So we specialize in sending out releases for people. The great thing about press releases are they're very simplistic. If you understand the form, the place to put your creativity and energy is in your quote, the first person quote. You want your quote to be something that can't be easily paraphrased so that it's lost. And you also want to make sure that you put a little flourish and creative thought into what it is that you're actually releasing. What's the strategy behind it?
So sorry. Is there a service, is there like somewhere we could see the pricing or something like that?
Yeah, if you just visit eReleases.com and click on pricing, it'll show you the breakdown of the packages that we offer.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I should have that link ready to go in the notes here. I did not. I'll get that real quick here. Here we go. I'm gonna drop that in the chat for everybody who's interested. And Mickie, another question. So the actual press release itself, let's imagine that we've done one or a few. What are some of the major results that you think that people can expect from it? Like, what's the expectation that we should have on a press release? Is it going to bring us new listenership? Is it going to just help elevate our name if it gets picked up? Like, what are some expectations that are realistic that people can have about this?
I think when it comes to podcast, it's not easy to get a lot of immediate attention. I think in the case of you, there was like 3 or 4 articles, and most of them were little snippets, little roundup snippets. So it wasn't a huge success. It was a moderate success. And, for a first release, it was good. I feel like if we were to do something like a survey or study going forward, we might get better. I would say, my goal whenever I do a survey or study is it wasn't successful if we got less than 8 articles about it. Anybody who does a survey or study that I help them with, and we come up with a couple of oddball questions, I've never had it not be at least 8 articles written about them. So that's my go-to now, and I champion the survey and study because it just works. It's one of those things that when you've developed a survey or study and you've got certain questions right now, it's a little life of its own and a snapshot of your industry and the questions that you asked. And right now is a perfect time to do a survey because we're post-pandemic. And so a lot of people don't know how their industry is dealing with it and what the outlook is going forward. Is it positive? Is it negative? And so it's a great time to take a snapshot in your vertical, your space, and get people's perspective on it. And media would love to have that and to share those numbers with their readers.
It's really fascinating. You've got my wheels spinning here, Mickie. I've like taken a ton of notes here, and here's kind of like what I'm thinking about. And you just tell me if this is a cool strategy or not. What I'm thinking about is doing one survey, one study, and having, I don't know, I'm just going to say 10 questions on it. And those questions will cover some past podcast topics that I've hit on really aggressively, that have done really well, like episodes that have really stood out among some of the rest, and asking questions. So example, I did one recent episode with a guy named Guy Winch, and he was talking about how to turn off work thoughts while you're not working. So if I had one of those 10 questions being, how often do you think about work while you're not working? Is it all the time, sometimes? And that was one of my 10 questions. And I gathered 9 others on certain topics. Could I convert those into 10 press releases potentially, linking back to the episode that's sort of like the solution, I'll do air quotes there, about that? Like, would that idea kind of work, or am I thinking too uniquely about this?
The thing I like about it is each one is a separate topic, and the variety of the whole survey is you're covering several. The thing I don't like about it is if you break it into 10 press releases, you're really only giving the results of one question for that segment. I would love to have 2 or 3 questions around each topic so that there's a little variety and some more to work with. I think that anybody who publishes a survey or study, often they do highlight one of the major facts or responses that were part of the question, but they generally didn't know that that was going to be the most important question before they asked it. They probably asked 20, and of that, the most compelling thing was question 13, where we asked this, and we were really surprised that we got this as a result. And based on where things are right now, we think that's important because of X, Y, Z. And here's an explanation of why, people are, feeling really positive, but they're actually spending less money. So there's obviously an apprehension that's still happening, something like that. And I feel like it's going to be really difficult to accomplish that when it's just one question per segment.
Okay, that makes sense. No, that's actually really helpful. Again, taking notes here. Now, what if again have that one call to action, which is like an episode about that? Is that too like much of clickbait? Like I did the survey, so you listen to this, or is that type of call to action actually seem to work well?
I think that's really appropriate. I don't see a problem with it. It's very contextual. It's the survey lends itself directly to the podcast, and therefore it's a natural evolution of the press release to go from survey results. Here's a podcast we did just on this subject matter. It looks like it's tailor made for it. I think that would be quite appropriate.
Very cool. And how many people would you say would need to respond to a survey for it to be worthwhile? Because I'm imagining those numbers should be shared, right? Like if it's just me, my mom, and a couple of my friends, that's not really going to be enough, right?
Right. For small industries, 100 or more responses is usually fine. If it's a really broad subject like entrepreneurship or something like that, I think the more the better. And so, 2, 3, 400 would be really great. I think that anything beyond that is just gravy, icing on the cake. But I would shoot for something like that. And if your community is not big enough, maybe you could partner with other people to piggyback on their social media, or you could go the route of a trade association that would be a perfect fit for your community.
Very cool. Super helpful, Mickie. This has been a lot of fun. I want to give the floor to anyone else real quick. Make sure there's no other questions that are kind of lingering that have not come through the chat. Feel free to unmute if anybody has any question. If not, we're going to move on here, but I want to give everyone just a chance to ask a question. Any questions for Mickie? All right. I think you've made this really clear, Mickie. This has been great. So where can we, if we want to work with you, where can we find out more? I'd love to hear a little bit about
Sure.
that. And then I'll ask you to share kind of a final thought and parting. But first, I'd like to hear how we can learn more about you.
Okay, so my website's eReleases.com. All my social media is on the lower right. I do check my LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to find me. I'm not on Twitter, these other places as much. We have chat on the website and a phone number. Feel free to call. You'll only speak to an editor. We have no salespeople, no commissions. If we feel it's not a good fit, we're usually pretty honest. Just like I told that carpet company, I didn't think that they were going to do very well, but we eventually found a way to make it work. I have a free masterclass that focuses solely on press release strategies, in particular the ones that work, like the survey and study. It's at eReleases.com/plan, PLAN. It's completely free for now. And I would encourage anyone who's new to be able to listen to it with an eye of, is there some holes that are coming up here that I could plug my podcast in and strategically develop something that would probably work? And I think that, it's less than an hour long, and it really goes into some really great strategies that may work for you.
So cool. Mickie, I thank you so much for your time today, man. This was a lot of fun getting to talk to you on this topic. I personally learned a lot, and I'm hoping that other people feel the same way. Before I let you go, though, do you have any final thoughts, word of wisdom on this topic before we close out?
I would just say, realize that PR and press releases, they're about leverage. We did a single press release last year for the Dining Bond Initiative. It was an announcement that this Dining Bond Initiative was taking place. It was designed to help restaurants that were closed during the pandemic. You could support your local restaurant and buy a gift certificate at 50% the retail price of it. And the money immediately went to the restaurants. It got over 150 articles. Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, all the food travel magazines picked it up. They did millions of dollars in revenue. And I challenge anyone who creates a great Google ad or Facebook ad to create something that costs, under $300 that can generate, 16 to $20 million in revenue. It just doesn't happen. But potentially, if you have a very strong newsworthy message like this, you can get that. And it's all about leverage. And that's the opportunity that PR holds if you can just crack the code and make it work for you.
Powerful way to end today, Mickie. Thank you so much. It's all about that leverage. Mickie, thanks again for being here, man. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.